So where were we? Great. We're back to our landscape layer material. So I'm going to open this up again. I'm back in my material graph. And what we want to do is replace these placeholder colors, so these colors that we were just using to get a general sense of how the whole system works, with the textures that we brought in from Quixel earlier. If you are totally new to the idea of materials, the process of taking a texture and applying it to an object is called sampling. So you sample a piece of that texture that corresponds to a piece on the mesh that you are trying to apply the material to. So the whole process is called sampling textures or texture sampling. So what we want to do is search for a texture sample node, and it should texture sample. Right, if you type in texture, it'll assume that you want a texture sample node. And that brings up this thing, which asks you for a texture and UVs. So the UVs of the landscape are quite simple to extract. You again search for landscape layer coords. So the landscape layer coords are the UVs of the landscape. If the term UV doesn't make sense to you right now, don't panic about it. It's not super important to understand for this video. Just know that we need those landscape layer coords to be able to apply the texture to the right area of the landscape. So I'm going to take those coords, pop them into the UVs, and then for the text, I have two options. One is I could hard set the texture using the details panel over here, or I could create a texture object and use this texture object to set the texture of the material. I think I'll do that. So I'm going to take this texture object, feed it into texture, and then take the output of this texture sample into layer dark grass. So this collection of nodes here now reads from the landscape, applies a specific texture, which at the moment is arbitrary, just a default texture, and then feeds the output of that into the layer blend node. So if we hit save, then back in our viewport, you can see now everywhere that was dark green has been replaced with this default texture. But that's not right, because we don't want the default texture. We want our own custom chosen grass material. So all we have to do for that is click on the texture object, and then where it says default texture, find our grass. So I think it's called grass, right? Clover patches, grass, then hit save, the material will rebuild, and there we go. So now we've got our grass in the area where the dark grass is. And if we do that same process for all of the other colors, then we'll have our textures painted on correctly. So I'm going to copy those nodes, paste them to the light grass, paste them to the sand, and paste them to the layer wet mud. Delete those colors because I don't need them anymore. And then hit save. And something has gone terribly wrong because now the whole scene is grass. But that's okay, that's totally expected. What we need to do is replace these texture objects with the correct textures. So at the moment they are all grass textures, but I don't want that. I want this light grass to be a light grass. But I've forgotten the name of my light grass, so I don't really know what to search for. So there's another way that we can bring a texture object into this material, and that's by selecting the texture in our content browser. So let's choose this uncut grass. It's kind of lighter than the other one. Select one of these textures. The textures are the red objects, not the green one, because that's the material. and then drag that into, and you can see it knows what I want to do already. Unreal's very smart. And it says, there we go, pop that into that texture object, and now that texture has been replaced with the one that we want. And let's do the same thing for sand layer. So I'll go into sand. Yeah, let's try the gravel one. Oops, I chose the wrong type. So I want to choose the gravel texture. And obviously I'm choosing the texture that's the color information and not the texture that's the normal information. So the one that's purple, we'll talk about in a little bit. The one that's brown, the one that looks like the actual texture itself, is the one that we want to bring in. I'll select this texture object, bring in the ground, hit save on that. And now I have sand in the sandy areas. And if I was to paint on the light grass over here, then that light grass gets painted on. And I don't have a texture for wet mud because that was a impromptu addition. So let's just quickly go back into Quixel Bridge. I think I already have some I guess I don't. So I'll find a surface with some, what do you think mud would be called? Sand? Other. Soil. There we go, mud. That's what I want. This one will do. I'll add it to my project. It's already been added. So now we can take the wet mud texture in our material graph and wet mud texture, trampled coal. Oh, it's not wet mud, but it'll do for now. Pop that into the correct slot, save the material, and now we have that texture coming through in that area. Excellent. So now we have replaced the primary solid colors with actual textures, but we're still not 100% there. It is very shiny. If I look at the sun, it's kind of bouncing all the sunlight off in a way that makes it look like it's plastic. And we don't really, I don't really like that. And it's also not very natural. Makes the ground look like it's cling film wrapped or something. So there's an easy fix to that and a more complex fix to that. The easy fix is to pop over into our materials, and where the landscape layer, the output node from before, where all of our information gets fed into, at the moment we have a default metallic and default specular and default roughness. And that's a kind of, and as you can see in the material preview window, that's a kind of semi-shiny, plasticky look. So to override those default values, we need to actually give it some information. We've already added an input to base color, which was a float 3, so RGB. There's 3 values, 1 value for red, green, and blue, and they get combined into 1. Unlike color, though, metallic, specular, and roughness all take a single value, so a single float, a float 1. And to create that, we can either right-click and search for float, no, constant, sorry, my bad, constant, and this will give us a number that we can adjust. Or an alternative way, the way that I'm used to, is press 1 on your keyboard and then click. Nope. Yeah, there we go. Press 1 on your keyboard and click, and then you get a number with 1. And that's the same for 1, 2, and 3. So if you want a 2 value, a float 2, then you've got RG. If you want a 3 value, you hold 3, click, and then you get this RGB color. In the case metallic, specular, and roughness, I just want 1 value. So I want my ground to be no metallic. I don't want any metal in my ground. So I'm going to say 0 into metal. my ground is going to be not metallic at all. We have organic materials for our ground. Specular, if you hover over that, it says used to scale the current amount of specularity on non-metallic surfaces, and is a value between 0 and 1, default at 0.5. That's not very helpful. Specular means specularity. So let's Google what specularity means. Have a look at some of the helpful images. Specularity is the visual appearance of specular reflections. Also not helpful. But a specular reflection is basically these brighter highlights where the light is bouncing off the material straight back at us. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in our material. So we've got the sunlight in the sky over there. And as the sun comes down and bounces off this into our eyes, it's kind of creating these shiny reflections just in that area where the sun's bouncing off. So if we turn around and look behind us, there's no specularity because the sun isn't bouncing off that direction. So this is a pretty common term in materials and shaders, and it is also a pretty common way of making something look very plastic. So if we wanted to remove or reduce this plasticity in our object, we could simply set the specular also to 0. So if I hit save on that, then now my material is not reflecting at all. So it's all totally what's called diffuse. So it's just generally bouncing light all around and not in any particular direction towards us. But what if we wanted a little bit of that specularity? Maybe we want some kind of shininess and bounce. So I'm going to set that to 0.1 just to add a little bit, which is still way too much. 0.01 maybe. All right, so now we've got, when we look over at the sun, we've got a little bit of kind of reflection, specular reflection coming from the sun, which would make sense if the leaves are kind of wet, if the grass is wet or something like that. And then the last thing that we can play around with is this roughness. Roughness refers to how reflective the material is. So if we set roughness at 0, it's a very smooth material. And if we set it at 1, it's a very kind of matte, diffuse material. So let's go ahead and set roughness to 1 just to see what happens. You can see that now, even though we have some specularity, so let's set the specular to 0.5, which is the default. So even though we have a lot of specularity here, so that was what was giving us those shiny reflections before, because our material is a lot more rough, they're still specular. So if we look over this way, you can see it's sort of darker green, and then if we turn around, there's a lot of lighter green there. It's just being bounced a lot more roughly. So it's as if the material was more of like a frosted glass kind of thing than a smooth mirror. So if we were to set that roughness down to 0.5, instead of rebaking the material, I'm just going to look at this preview material now. So here, as we move our roughness down, 0.1 gives us something really shiny. There's a hot spot there where the sun is, and it's kind of reflecting everything else around the scene. So if we save that, we've got kind of like a smooth mirror surface, which again is not something you probably want in your grass, but it is an option. This looks like it's now really been wrapped in cling film or something. But generally, okay, so this is all to say, generally for our landscapes, if we're just doing a big, broad brushstroke, we want a pretty high roughness. So the roughness of the landscape it's going to be quite rough and not really like polished, and the specularity also pretty low. So we're not going to be reflecting super bright lights around the scene, and the material itself isn't going to be very reflective. So those are values that work for me. In this case, and you may want to play around with these values and choose something else, but that's kind of what works for me. Here's a question though: what if we wanted the grass to be like it is right now, pretty diffuse and not very reflective, but this wet mud, because it's wet and it's kind of shiny, we want this to be actually a little bit more reflective. What we did with the layer blend for the textures, we can totally do with any other parameter of our material as well. So we can say, instead of having a constant specular across the entire scene, we could have different speculars for the different landscape layers. So let's just quickly map that up and copy the landscape, the layer blend node. And I'm going to do it just with specular at the moment. I'll leave roughness at a default 0.5. Okay. And then let's just see what this looks like now all together with. Right. Okay. So this is kind of like it's a really shiny specular in the muddy area, and also a really shiny specular in the grassy area. But if I take the landscape layer node and put the specular of 0.1, which is quite specular, as you can see here, into the wet mud, and then put 0 into everything else, yeah, that might have confused you at the moment if I did that and that was unexpected. This 0 you can apply to multiple different things. So one output node can apply to many input nodes. So I've just basically said the 0 comes into dark grass, light grass, and sand, and 0.1 goes into wet mud. And when we hit save, that means that the grass is going to be really really diffuse, so there's no reflections. But then when we go to the wet mud, it's really spicy. So let's take that roughness up a little bit more. 2.8. I don't know. This is now where you start just playing around with numbers and sinking a whole bunch of time into it. So I don't want to spend all of my time doing that. This is just to indicate, maybe actually a point. Too muddy? I don't know. Quite too reflective. Roughness? So quite smooth? Yeah, I don't love it. Anyway, the point is that you can totally take different attributes and put them through a layer blend node. One thing that you might notice in that case is that it could begin to become unwieldy to have multiple of these layer blend nodes for every single parameter that you want to change. So let's say we're about to add normals as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let's say you had the normals, you also had a roughness blend for all the different roughness values. It's going to get pretty unwieldy pretty quick and have them all feed into different layer blends. What I want to do before we move on is sort of introduce a kind of trick which will help us consolidate all of these layer blends into one. And that trick is called material attributes. So if you click a random part of your graph and just make sure that nothing else is selected, you get the general settings of the graph. And that's under this details panel. We have materials. And there's a checkbox called use material attributes. And what that does is it takes the whole material node, all of those settings that you saw earlier, and kind of squishes them into one Uber setting. So this material attributes is a node which contains all of those different parameters. And you can feed into that node by creating a make material attributes node. This material attributes node contains all of the information that you could possibly put into the final output of this material. So we've got familiar names like base color, metallic, specular, roughness, etc., etc., etc. We've also got a couple of other ones which we didn't see before. We don't have to worry about those. This is just all of the possible things that you could feed into a material attribute. And the reason that this is useful is we can create 4 material attributes, put them like that, parallel to each other, and feed those in through one single layer blend node. What am I doing? Okay, it's taking a while. It's a little bit of a setup, but the payoff is worth it, I promise. And take the output of this layer blend into the landscape, into the material attributes output. So this way we can treat each one of these material attributes as its own separate thing. And to help me keep organized, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one and press C and call this dark grass. C adds a comment node, so it creates a little option to comment around a set of nodes. So this one's going to be light grass. This one is going to be C. This one's going to be sand. And this one's going to be mud. So now I can treat each of these attributes as its own separate material. And I don't have to be worrying about which layer blends go into what and all sorts of nonsense like that. I can delete all of my layer blend nodes except for the final one, and then work on one kind of material at a time. Okay, so here I am. I've got my texture sampler, which I'm going to feed into the base color. And now I'm going to set up the metallic, specular, and roughness just for the dark grass. So I know that I want no metallic and no specular and a roughness of 1. So this is, I mean, roughness doesn't matter at this point because there's no specular, but I like to be extra careful and just make sure that my grass is going to be completely unreflective, no reflectivity at all. Maybe we come in one day and tweak that a little bit, but that's good enough for now. And the next thing that I'm going to do is add in a normal map. So this texture patches, the grass patches texture came in as a surface from Quixel with 3 different textures. There's the color texture, which we've used already, and the normal, which we haven't used yet. If you are not familiar with normals, you don't have to know too much about what they do, but the normal map is just a way for us to get a little bit more of a sense of how light bounces off an object. It helps us add a little bit of bumpiness. If we look at this texture right now, it looks very much like a flat texture that has been kind of just pasted on to a flat object. So the normal map will help us make this appear a little bit more bumpy, almost by magic. All right, so to add a normal map, what we need to do is create another texture sample. So I'll type texture sample, and then in this case, I'm just going to, I'll do it a different way, just to show you that there are different ways. Instead of creating a texture object, I'm just going to drag the normal, I've got to select the texture sampler and then drag the normal into the texture slot of that texture sample. All right, once I've done that, then I can take these landscape coords and pop them into the UVs again, and take the RGB out from that into normal. Do be careful, just make sure. At this point, it's always good to double check that if you are sampling a normal, it works slightly different from any other color texture. So if you are sampling a normal, make sure the sampler type under the texture, you can't even see it. So we've added in the correct texture, and then just make sure that the sampler type is normal. It should do that by default, so you don't have to worry. But if your normals are looking weird, do come back and just make sure the sampler type is normal. All right, then I hit save. Okay, it is broken. I wonder if that's because I just have to make sure that the others have some materials applied. So I'm going to add the textures back in. There we go. Okay, yes, I just had to make sure that each material did have its base color information. Okay, we're still getting a little bit of a strangeness. I think I know what's going on. I think we need the normal map for each, for the blending to apply correctly. Tell you what I'll do is on each of the other materials, I'm just going to apply a default normal. For now, which we will replace later. I'm just going to apply a flat normal texture to the normal of each of the others. And I think this is because you do need some normal input on every attribute to for the blending to work correctly. Yes, there we go. That looks much better. Okay, so now that we've added the normal to this grass, you can see that it looks a lot more bumpy than if we were to, let's say, replace it. If we replaced the normal with that flat normal from before, then the grass seems pretty flat. But if we add the grass normal that we brought in, then we now have a lot more detail. It kind of creates shadows where you'd expect there to be shadows because of the direction of the light. Normals are accentuated as well by specular and roughness. So the more specular or smooth an object is, so if we were to set the roughness to 0.5, you'd see that the reflections are also affected by those normals. Depending on the type of material that you have, you might want to have a sort of pretty smooth object as well, because the normals really kind of help break up the light reflections of those objects. But in my case, because I am dealing with grass, like I said before, I don't want any specular, and I don't want any roughness. I mean, full roughness. And we still get a little bit of the shadowing and the details, but we just don't get any sort of reflective highlights. Okay, so let's do that for the other materials as well, such as this wet mud. So it's looking pretty flat at the moment, and let's go ahead and find our wet mud material and turn that into, it was coal, right? Yeah, trampled coal. So add the trampled coal normal, and now you can see that it adds a lot of those like tiny little details and accentuates them that otherwise are hidden with just the color texture. So then we can do the same with the sand. At this point, I think you understand the exactly what's going on. I will say, I hope it's pretty obvious, but if you are adding texture packs, so you're adding something that you got from Quixel, make sure that the color texture matches the normal texture, because it's quite easy to put in the wrong normal. For instance, this is the wrong normal, and then your color texture won't match the normal, and that might look a little bit weird. All right, well done everyone for getting this far. We are almost there. There's just one or two more things that I want to talk about. In actual fact, we are there. At this point, you have the tools and you have the material, more importantly. So if you've been following along and you have a landscape layer material with a bunch of different texture slots, then that you've set up with the textures you chose from Quixel, then great. You have the tools to go and start painting on your different textures into different areas. So if I were to try to blend this grass a little bit better by removing some of it, pressing Shift and clicking and removing it and blending those two grasses together and creating patchiness, all sorts of different goodness. That's basically what the assignment is. Now take your reference image and try to recreate the colors of that reference image and the textures using these paint tools. For the moment, though, I encourage you to explore the landscape tool a little bit more. Create your materials, browse Quixel, download some different surfaces and see what they are like in your project. And just have fun with the material graph. It can be a really fun place to explore different looks and concepts for your scene.